So welcome to Global Conversations, our round 3. We are so excited to have Chloe Angyal with us today, who is an author and I would say a feminist activist. I think that's fair, at least writing from a really informed perspective about a number of women's issues. We're also being joined today by our research director, Isabelle Vail. And so we're delighted to have this group together and see where the conversation goes. So Isabelle, if you could go ahead.
Yeah, Chloe. So I think we want to start out pretty simple and just give our audience an idea of your background, what led you to become contributing editor for Marie Claire, and in what ways are you involved in dance, the arts, ballet? So we'll start there.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. It's really great to be here, and I use DDP's data all the time, so I'm really grateful to be here and grateful for the work that you do. I suspect a lot of people who you've interviewed already, I started dancing almost as soon as I could walk. Our family photo albums are full of photos of me wearing a tutu at an inappropriate time. And, wearing ballet slippers with bathing suits, because what is a bathing suit if not a leotard that you can swim in? And I danced for a lot of my childhood and certainly all of my teen years after a small foray into very serious gymnastics. And around the time that I finished college, I discovered journalism. I discovered how thrilling it was to get published. I started writing for my college paper and just fell in love with the feeling of contributing something to a conversation and sparking a response, whether that was positive or negative. And I've been chasing that dopamine high ever since. So I've been a journalist for about 10 years, in part because I was always a strong writer, and I took very seriously the idea that each and every one of us has a responsibility to figure out what it is that we're good at and how we can use that skill and that talent and that ability to make the world a better place. So my journalism has always come from a place of social change, of writing for social change. I've never really had much interest in the kind of journalism that just calls balls and strikes. I've always come to journalism from the perspective that if you're going to do this hard work, and journalism is hard work and important work, if you're going to do it, you should do it around issues that really shape people's lives, whether that's, reproductive rights or the ways that women and gender are represented in pop culture, both issues that I've reported on and worked on. And so that's how I came to start writing about ballet, which was something that I had loved for a very long time. And a love that had always been kind of complicated, because if you're a feminist person and you love ballet, then there are some circles that you have to square, right? You have to really sit with the fact that this thing that you love doesn't necessarily conform to the values that you hold, and you have to sort of sit with that incongruity. And that led me to ask questions about what would it look like if ballet did conform to my values? What if ballet was a place that valued equity, that worked against exclusion, that made all people feel welcome and included and valued and centered, instead of just what ballet has traditionally been, which is overwhelmingly white, very male dominated, extremely elitist, and in the habit of excluding the very people who can keep it vibrant and sustainable in the 21st century.
We did have a question planned about that movement away from objectivity in journalism, but I think you kind of touched on that, how you think it's...
I'm happy to go deeper on it if you want.
Yeah, we'd love to expand on that. And then after that, I'd also like to ask, in that frame of mind, structural reform, making ballet more inclusive, what are the reforms, the tangible actions, in your opinion, that are going to make ballet, dance, the arts more equitable, diverse, and inclusive?
I think it begins with asking a really important question, which is, who is ballet for? And by that I mean, who are the audiences that we want watching ballet? Who are the people that we want dancing ballet? Who are the people that we want making ballet? Ultimately, who is this art form supposed to serve? Because when we talk about structural changes. We aren't just talking about like, we'll put a more diverse array of bodies on stage, or we will tell a small number of stories that tell a different version of a narrative about women, right? When we talk about structural change, we're asking really big questions of who is this for and who does this serve? Who gets power in this situation and who doesn't? And so simply nibbling around the edges or making cosmetic changes, especially public-facing changes of who the audience sees on stage, it's not that those changes aren't meaningful to the individual dancers who get opportunities that they might have otherwise been denied, but that ballet is still going to be for the same audience, right? So the question of who is ballet for, who is it here to serve, whose stories is it here to tell, and whose dreams does it say matter? Like, whose ballet dreams matter? Those are the kinds of structural questions that lead us to changing the way ballet education is structured, or changing the way that we run ballet companies, right? The hierarchy of a ballet company or the hierarchy of a ballet school, right? Structural changes, it's a phrase that everyone loves to throw around, and that's great. But it can mean some really radical stuff, and we need to get comfortable with that. We need to get comfortable with the fact that, you know, nibbling around the edges feels fine. It doesn't encroach too much on our idea of who ballet is for and what it's supposed to look like. But if we were to get really structural and really radical, it might mean breaking ballet's gender binary, right? It might mean that we no longer have a strictly gendered ballet curriculum in which girls dance certain steps and boys dance certain steps, and girls wear point shoes and boys don't, right? It might mean ballets that are like gender fluid casted, which means that like anyone can dance Albrecht and anyone can dance Jezebel. And that would radically change who would show up to those ballets, right? It might alienate some of the most traditional, some of the most reliable traditional donors and supporters. And that's what structural change means. It's not nibbling around the edges. It's making really big, radical changes that ultimately mean that ballet will survive in the 21st century and won't become a rickety, traditional version of the past that appeals to a very small number of consumers and a very small number of performers.
We hear a lot that this is, you know, just a pipeline issue, but it sounds like what you're saying is this is a change that can happen at every level of the institution that is ballet. And I think that's a really, really interesting approach to that.
It is not only a pipeline issue, right? Who makes the pipeline? Who decides what is valued in the pipeline, right? It's the leaders at the top who get to decide, these are the kind of dancers that we're looking for, or these are the kind of choreographers whose works we want to lift up. I think, with all due respect to the people at the top, I think it's a cop-out to say that it's a pipeline issue, because that is abdicating the responsibility that they, as leaders, are supposed to be taking on. Either lead or don't, but don't say it's a pipeline issue, because that's shirking your responsibility as a leader.
Yeah, I'm interested.
Sorry, I came in a little hot on that one. It really annoys me.
I love it. That's exactly what you're supposed to be doing.
Come on, man.
No, it's fabulous. So one of the things that, two observations here, and I'd love you to comment on them if they're of interest to you. First of all, I find ballet to be, supposedly it's a performing art and it's deeply creative. I think it's one of the most stuck, uncreative, iterative, nonsensical art forms. There's a number of other art forms that I would lump with that, opera being one of them. The fact that, 92% of the art market is controlled by 7 men. And so we don't just see it in ballet. So one, it's not terribly creative. And two, a lot of what is going on in ballet, I think, is very much against the economic interests of the company that these leaders are supposed to be running. And I'm wondering if it's unconscious bias, iris bonnet. I'm wondering if they just don't get out much. And when they do get out, they get out with the same 6 or 7 guys. And they're not leaving the studio. And that's why they keep telling the same stories over and over again. Most of them from the male perspective. And by the way, I would argue, and this is a little bit radical, that the gender exploration is almost completely from a male point of view. Let's put a tutu on a guy. What does it feel like for a man to explore his female side? You don't see a lot of opportunities coming back for women to do what Ashley Bowder does and take men's class.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll throw that back to you, see where you want to go with that.
I will say, so I just finished reporting this book, and to write Turning Point, I talked to almost 100 members of the dance world, and that I broadly interpret that to mean dancers and former dancers, choreographers, artistic directors, teachers, students, parents of students, healthcare providers, and even a costume designer. And I found myself getting frustrated by how it is enormously frustrating to listen over and over again to some of the most creative people in the world simply fail to imagine beyond the tradition and beyond the sort of rigid boundaries of what ballet is right now. And to be fair, there are certainly people who are sort of sounding the alarm and saying, if we do not expand, if we do not diversify our idea of what ballet can look like, if we do not get sort of radical and structural about this thing we love is going to die. And I want to give those people full credit. But I do think it's a failure of imagination and a failure of leadership to say that this is the way ballet has to look or feel, or these are the people that ballet has to serve, or these are the stories that ballet has to tell, or this is the way a company has to be run. And I do feel enormous sympathy, particularly for women in ballet who have been trained from a very young age, that the way to succeed in this art form is to be silent, compliant, and obedient, to not question authority, to do as you're told, to execute. That stifles creativity. That inhibits your ability to imagine a world beyond. And some of those people manage to be enormously creative despite that training. But if we're really going to imagine a wild, diverse, successful, sustainable future for ballet, we are going to have to unleash the creativity of some of the people who've been trained by ballet to tamp that creativity down. Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense. So therefore, what does a successful ballet company look like? And you get to be as imaginative as you like. Not going under is one good example, but I'm not sure that being the biggest, having the biggest budget necessarily means you're particularly successful.
Sure. I think a successful ballet company is one that makes both its patrons and its dancers feel seen and understood. So as a patron, I don't take a lot of dance classes anymore. I was never a professional dancer, so I can't speak to that experience. But as patron, as someone who goes to the ballet or went to the ballet as often as they could, I want to go see stories that make sense to my life. And that doesn't necessarily mean I don't want to see Jezebel, but I don't want to see a Jezebel told from a white male perspective and set in rural Germany in the 1830s anymore. If you're going to tell that story, and it's survived because it's a timeless story, if you're going to tell that story, I need you to tell it to me in a way that makes sense to my life in 2020. I want to feel seen. I want to feel understood. I want my humanity affirmed by what I see on stage. And so that means, what kinds of stories are we telling and how? It means, are we putting a diverse array of dancers on stage? And I mean by race, I mean by size, I mean by ability. There is a great company in San Francisco called Access Dance that is putting both able-bodied and disabled dancers on stage, both together and separately. It is thrilling. It is one of the most incredible things I have ever seen. And frankly, it makes an able-bodied core of swans, most of whom are white and incredibly thin, so boring. So boring.
We know Access's work. It's very cool.
Yeah, it's cool. And the thing is, given how hard they have had to work to carve out a space for themselves in the dance world, you would think that it's radical. The reality is, it's just not that radical. Every one of us knows someone who has a disability. Some of us are people who have disabilities. The idea that there is a place for people in ballet with both visible and invisible disabilities should not be radical, right? And imagine what that would do for audience members who could go to the ballet and see themselves on stage. So that's one definition of success. I think another is a company that treats its dancers in a way that respects their autonomy, that respects their artistry, that cares for their mental health and their physical health. And it's really important to remember that for dancers, those two things are basically interchangeable. Dancers that get paid a decent wage, that have job stability, that don't have to worry about dancing through an injury because they're on a 1-year contract and they can't afford to spend 2 months of that year not dancing because their contract might not get re-upped the next year. Right, so dancers who feel safe and secure in their employment and not that there is a massive power imbalance in between them and management or them and the guest choreographer. So a successful company is one that really respects its dancers. There are lots of companies that talk a great game about their artists, and they call them artists, but these people are athletes, and they're artistic athletes. They need the kind of support that professional athletes get in this culture. And that's not solely on the companies, right, who are on a shoestring budget and denied the government support that they deserve. But respectfully, if you cannot afford to treat your workers well, then you shouldn't have workers.
Part of what I love so much about your writing is that you put ballet in, Teresa Ruth Howard calls the bubble within the bubble. You put ballet within the context of femininity and what it is to be a girl in America or a girl in the culture. We are actually compiling a list of all the ballets that involve physical violence against women, and I would have thought that list would start getting smaller and these pieces would not be choreographed or somebody would commission a choreographer to do a double rape, but yet we continue to see them. I'd love you to talk a little bit around where ballet and the ideas of femininity and perfection fit in our culture.
Sure. And that's partly where this book began, because I was writing about gender and power and representations of femininity. And I remember very distinctly the day that I was in college and the concept of effortless perfection was explained to me. The idea that high achieving women feel a pressure to be really professional, really successful professionally, to be gorgeously attractive, to be thin and fit, to be sort of socially successful. And this is based on a study that was done on a college campus at Duke in the early 2000s. And they felt the pressure to do all of those things, right? The academics, the sort of athletic, slim body, the social success. They felt the pressure to do all of those things without breaking a sweat, without appearing to try. And the phrase that was coined was effortless perfection, right? Stanford has a version, it's called Stanford Duck Syndrome, where you're sort of gliding smoothly along and no one can see the frantic paddling that's happening underneath the surface. And I remember hearing that sort of set of ideas and thinking, oh, that's just ballet. Like that's just how we were taught to be in ballet, that no matter how hard you're working, no matter how much pain you're in, the audience should never be able to see it. The teacher should never be able to see it, right? You should work about as hard at concealing the work as you do at the work itself. And for me, that just seemed like such a perfect metaphor for femininity itself, right? For womanhood itself. Not only are we expected to be perfect all the time, but we're never supposed to tell anyone or show anyone how hard we work at that perfection. And so that's sort of where this book began and where this idea of ballet as a sort of hypercharged, hyper-distilled version of the larger experience of womanhood began. The other place it began was that I was explaining what it was like to go on pointe for the first time to a friend who'd never done ballet. And I said, okay, you have to understand, you work towards this milestone for like 7 years. It's all you dream about. You can't wait to do it. It's a rite of passage. It like marks you as a real dancer, like a real grown-up dancer. And then you do it and you realize it's mostly just pain and bleeding. And like, what a great metaphor for puberty as a woman or as a person in a female body. What a great metaphor for what I thought womanhood was going to be. And then I just discovered it's like mostly discomfort and bleeding. And that's sort of where this book began. It's not where the book ended, but that's definitely been the sort of the metaphorical engine that has driven my work in the last couple of years.
Want to give us 3 or 4 takeaways from the, I mean, I love the premise. Yes, 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 yes. Can't wait to read it.
Thank you.
Please give me advance copy. But any takeaways, because your title is pretty hopeful, isn't it? How a new generation of dancers is saving ballet from itself.
It is hopeful. There are lots of people in ballet who love it and who are trying to turn it into something that is actually worthy of that love. And I find that really admirable. But by the same token, there are lots of people who ballet has pushed out, who have left ballet traumatized and injured, and really brokenhearted because this thing that they loved didn't want them, didn't have room for them, and wasn't creative enough to figure out how to make room for them. And so this book is about the future of ballet. There are plenty of histories. I read lots of them. I found them really valuable. There are plenty of histories of ballet, but this book is about the future of ballet and about how ballet can become an art form that has room for all of the people it has traditionally excluded, whether that's by race, by class, by body shape, by ability, by gender identity. And so, you know, because if we take ballet as a metaphor for womanhood itself, this is a book about sexual harassment and mental health and physical health. It's a book about workers' rights. It's a book about masculinity. It's a book about how we build a sustainable, vibrant, exciting, and inclusive version of ballet that can survive through the 21st century.
How big is the book? How many pages? 5,690.
I mean, it you know, it definitely has its limits. One boundary that I set on it is that it is only about American ballet. I obviously did not grow up in America. You can tell from my accent. I grew up in Australia, but I've lived here for the last 15 years. I do my reporting here. And, you know, if I was going to write a book about ballet as a global phenomenon, I would have to travel to, you know, dozens of different countries and speak many different languages. So it is a book about American ballet, and it is about 250 pages long.
So how are you breaking down the topics? Is it like a topic, a chapter, an interview, a type of interviewee, a chapter? I've been wondering that because I've seen the layout of it.
Yeah, so each chapter is centered around a different theme, answers, or the experience of a different member of the ballet world. So a choreographer, a ballet mom, a professional dancer, a dancer who would have been professional but was pushed out, a choreographer, another professional dancer, and another ballet mom. One of the major takeaways of this book is that ballet runs on moms. This book has given me an opportunity to think and write about the ways that parenting labor is so gendered and the way that ballet intensifies that because it's such a feminine activity. I met so many ballet dads who would say things like, oh yeah, you know, I do the pickup and the drop off, and sometimes I go backstage and I help build sets for Nutcracker. And then I would meet the ballet moms and they would say, well, she started off in Freeds, but they were a little too loose at the heels. So now we've got her in some capezios, but I think we're going to transition her into something else after Nutcracker. And like, that's such a great microcosm of what straight parenting is like in America for so many moms, that they are just taking on so much more of the intellectual and emotional labor of parenting, especially parenting girls.
Thank you, Chloe Angyal, for joining us for round 3 of Global Conversations. This was a really fun roundtable interview, and we look forward to reading Turning Point in May of 2021. You know, if theaters are still closed, that'll give us one more thing to enjoy and savor. So thanks again for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It was great.